Renewable energy, going green, reducing our carbon footprint. Is it really about saving the planet, or is there another agenda? Welcome to Freedom Alive. While our power bills increase, the push from the government for green energy increases. But how will all this affect our lives and our freedom? Energy advisor Dave Walsh joins us on this episode to explain what's really happening behind the scenes and the geopolitical change in energy control from the West to the East. I'm blessed to again be joined by our co-host, Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel. And Matt, Dave Walsh says this narrative of renewable energy saving us in the next 20 to 30 years is a myth. Mathematically, it doesn't work. It can't work. I'm very interested to hear how he unpacks this for us. And when it comes to green energy, I have a feeling we're being duped with a very different agenda.
Well, I think we are being duped with a different agenda, and I can't wait to share this interview with Dave Walsh here about his knowledge and expertise in this amazing field. You know, when I was in high school, we had global cooling that we were frightened with. They were trying to scare us into the fact that we were about ready to enter an ice age. And then when that didn't happen, we shifted to global warming. And then now it's climate change, so it doesn't matter whether it's warm or cold, and obviously the climate will always change. And that constant narrative is being used to push so-called green energy. But when you really start to do the numbers, if everybody drove electric cars, for example, there would not be enough power to be powering and charging these cars. There wouldn't be enough sources. There certainly wouldn't be enough power. And batteries operate differently in different climates. I mean, we all know that. When you have a car battery and it's very cold, sometimes your battery can go dead very quickly versus if it's a warmer climate. Well, the batteries in cars in Minnesota or North Dakota, they're going to have a much shorter lifespan and power charge than they would be, for example, in Florida. So it doesn't have a cookie cutter template. It's a real problem. There's lots of things that we can unpack during this interview with Dave Walsh.
So much to bring to you at home, but our Freedom Alert is next.
Atheists demand Minnesota jail remove 10 Commandments display. A new $75 million jail in Itasca County, Minnesota has a two-story mural of the 10 Commandments in the gym, as well as other motivational statements on faith and governance throughout the jail. So the Freedom from Religion Foundation then pressured county administrators to remove the religious displays. The atheist group told county officials to repaint and repent, and then demanded that the county apologize for wasting money on 2 paint jobs. However, the atheist group cites the lemon test as the reason. But the lemon test, which was used to interpret government overreach into religion and remove religious displays from government buildings, has been dead for almost 2 years. That is, thanks to Liberty Counsel's Christian flag case as well as the Coach Kennedy case. Lemon is dead and no more.
Up next, Matt's interview with Dave Walsh.
I'm pleased to welcome our special guest, Dave Walsh. He is the former president and CEO of Mitsubishi Power and also a former executive with Westinghouse Electric in both power generation and industrial service roles as general manager and chairman of the Westinghouse Global Industrial and Power Generation Services and their various subsidiaries. So you have an incredible background in this area. Before we talk about the issue of green energy, I want to give a little bit of background about your work in the area of power and in this particular subject matter.
Well, at Westinghouse, I ran their power generation service business. Covered the world serving gas turbines, steam turbines, generators. I ran their China joint ventures for power. We had 5 major investments in China with the Chinese government to manufacture steam turbines, generators, and balance of plant equipment for coal plants in China. Did that back in the late 90s. I left when Siemens bought Westinghouse. I left there and founded the Mitsubishi Power Systems business in the Western Hemisphere with the parent company is Mitsubishi Heavy of Japan.
I want to talk about the so-called green energy. There is this, geopolitical change that's happening with regards to green energy. And of course, the Biden administration is pushing this among other entities and agencies throughout our United States government. Lay the landscape for us about what's happening globally, certainly what's happening in the United States. And I want to talk about some of the issues with regards to so-called green energy.
Well, the most dramatic push for green energy is limited really to about 13 countries in the world. You know, we have 185 countries, plus or minus a few as things change year by year. But basically the 9 in Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada, limited to that group of countries, absolutely over the top, pushing a net zero decarbonization philosophy through energy production for power generation in those named countries. And what we're seeing is dramatic cost rise in all of those countries, led first by Western Europe, where specifically examples being Germany and England have gone on a just massive build out in the last 15 to 20 years of, in the case of England, wind and solar, in the case of Germany, wind and solar also with battery storage. Germany closing now all of its nuclear power plants, most of its coal plants, England closing all of its coal-fired generating plants, and now about a quarter of their nuclear plants have stopped building gas-fired power plants. And what you've got, what emerged in the Ukraine conflict, was the tremendous vulnerability of those countries and the balance of Western Europe to, while they were doing those things, quietly, massively importing large quantities of natural gas and oil from Russia to fuel their home heating. Commercial heating is all done by gas and oil. And their shortage of electricity supply from renewables. The issue with renewables and green energy is it hasn't changed from its development about 50 years ago en masse, and that is it's very intermittent and very part-time, and the energy quantity delivered from renewables is based on what nature gives you during the day. In the United States, for example, across the country, solar power provides enough radiant sunshine for electricity to be made only about 4.8 hours a day across the United States.
That's across the average, so it may be different based on Florida versus Minnesota and North Dakota.
Florida, believe it or not, is only 5.2.
Is that right? You would think it would be much more than that.
No, you've got the phenomenon known as night that really terminates this from about 4:30 in the afternoon until about 9 the next morning. Nothing in that time window. But then in the summer months, you're very familiar with, between about mid-June coming up here soon to the end of October, you've got a vast number of days, maybe more than half the days, where it becomes pretty dark by about 12:30 to 1 as the storms come through, daily showers. And that causes a massive reduction in the solar capability for making electricity. Yeah, over in Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas, and parts of Southern Cal, you've got out to 6.5, 7 hour a day capacity, and on a very predictable basis out there, because you've got nearly 310 days a year in that part of the country where solar can be predictably there during the day. Over here, it's not, especially in the summer when it's needed the most. Up in the upper Midwest and Northeast, places like New York, as you go north, latitudinally, you wind up with a shorter and shorter day for it. So you get up in the upper Midwest in New York, where we're now trying to widely apply it, you're into a 4.8 hour day, 4.7 hour day with lots of intermittent cloud cover from the Great Lakes. It just doesn't make sense. If you look at those Southwest states where you've got that abundance of constant sunshine that you can predict, it doesn't need subsidized. It's useful in those states. If you look in the upper Midwest and Northeast, north of North Carolina, it really makes no economic sense. Down here, a very marginal case in terms of cost, because the cost of it is about, depending on how you measure, 5 to 10 times the cost of the capital one would spend on building conventional gas-fired power plants. Because the shortage of electricity provides, given the land cost and the absolute capital cost of building it is so high.
Well, you need a lot of land for these solar powered, sections. You're seeing this all over, Florida and other parts of the country as well, where lots of land are these solar farms, if you will. But it's interesting when you're talking about the different needs. Like in Florida, you would need your power more in the summertime to cool. But in the wintertime, up in some other places, you're going to need your power in the wintertime. And of course, in the wintertime, in many northern or Midwestern states, you have a lot of cloud cover that's quite frequent every day, or like in Seattle, for example, you're having lots of cloud cover and lots of drizzle, lots of rain. So when you really need the power, you have less sun.
Right. No, let's state Florida, for example, has two seasonal peaks. The most jagged peak for power generation is the winter peak in January, February, early March, when we have mornings that are, sub 40 degrees, are the absolute peaks between 5:30 and about 9 a.m. of power consumption, most jaggedly in the year. The summer is more predictable, high peaks, but more predictable, of course, between, July 1 out to November 1. You've got a pretty continuous known time of day. The peak in the summer tends to be between 4 o'clock and 10 o'clock in the evening, when guess what? The solar irradiation goes away by 4:30. So to meet the summer peak, it's really not there. The more dangerous thing is to meet the winter peak, and we've seen this in Texas with wind, to meet the winter peak, which is morning between 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. It's not there at all. So this huge build out of solar, really, because it doesn't work in those time periods, largely here, for example, doesn't really at all address the peak time of day power needs, which becomes a huge, huge issue with why it's being built.
I know there was some time ago, there was a lawsuit from the state of Minnesota against the state of California, because California was having a time certain that everything needed to go to electric vehicles or increase the amount of electric vehicles. The problem with that is car manufacturers will manufacture for California, and that will affect the rest of the country. And the lawsuit from Minnesota against California was that, the climate's a lot different. The batteries don't last as long in a very cold climate like Minnesota as they might, for example, in a warmer climate like San Diego. Most people don't think about the differences in temperature and differences of cloud cover versus sun, and the different sequences of power usage based upon state to state to state.
Well, exactly. And Governor Newsom is mandating, and the state assembly in California, EVs by the mid-30s, is indeed irrational, because California, due to years and years and years of state policies against baseload conventional power production, beginning with nuclear power. The Diablo Canyon plant was supposed to have 8 reactors. It has 2. The Songs nuclear plant in San Diego is supposed to have 6. It had 2. They're closed now. So you've got 2 reactors left in the state. They also stopped coal-fired power in California in the late 80s. And now more recently have a severe attack on any conventional combined cycle gas plants. With all that history, California imports now about 36% of its electricity. It has a deficit of 36%. It imports from Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington, hydropower, because California itself doesn't make enough power. And that's the way that they've masked over, not wanting to be in what they perceive the dirty business of making electricity. They import vast quantities of it. And now you're going to convert the transportation fleet entirely to EVs. That would cause a doubling of the generation capacity in California that they don't have to begin with. So this simply doesn't work for the state. The quantity of electricity they're making and the importation of it causes it to be very, very expensive also.
I know recently in California, particularly this happens in the summer, and this is going to probably happen every summer, where you have a high usage of electricity. The governor in the state of California, they were urging people to not charge their cars, because they didn't have enough power to charge the cars. They needed to charge people's, or needed to have energy for their houses, for air conditioning, other kinds of things. So you wouldn't be able to use your vehicle. Let's talk about the EV, the electric vehicles. We want to talk about windmills and other things, and the impact of Russia, or I should say China, but also the global oil issue with Russia and all the other things that are happening with Ukraine. With electric vehicles, electric-powered vehicles, and this is where this lawsuit came about with respect to Minnesota versus California and Newsom's attempt to go electric by the mid-2030s. Do those really work? And what is the complications? Are they really green? I mean, they may produce less, when they're operating the vehicle, carbon footprint, but are they really green energy that we're talking about? And what's the consequences of EVs?
Well, they're a subject wholly unrelated to green energy. Here's the why. They run based on stored electricity in a battery in them. The electricity comes from your wall, which comes from a power plant or series of power plants nearby that furnish your electricity. If you look at the...
And right now, those power plants are not electric power.
Exactly. Well, here's where we go on that. The stable of power plants across the country today are 40% natural gas fired, about 19% coal fired, about 20% nuclear powered, about 6% hydro, and about 13, 14% renewables. Classic intermittent renewables, wind and solar, only about 13%. So the vast majority is fossil fuel, and then nuclear power, which, again, the left generally has not liked that either and worked very hard to shut that down years ago. So when you look at the electricity supply coming into an EV battery, you've got some issues with that. At the power plant, the efficiency is about, if it's a coal plant, it's about 35%. If it's a gas plant, about 53%, thermally efficient to make the electricity to begin with. So you've got a gigantic loss of, let's say, on average, 50% at the power plant to make the electricity. Then you've got line losses on average of about 22, 23% to get that power to a user site such as your home. On average in the country, you lose about 23% of the electricity in the transmission of it. So now we're 73% losses. And then if you take the fact the electric motor is 90% efficient, you've got a 10% loss in the electric motors on board the car. So you're all in about a 78 to 80% loss of power, loss of efficiency. Gasoline has losses associated with it in generation for a motor of about 66%. Electricity of close to 80%, given the daisy chain I just described. It's actually less efficient and largely a fossil-based use issue. So the environmental argument for CO2, it doesn't even hold water.
And is it even possible to eliminate all the fossil fuels or nuclear power plants and replace them with electric plants where you're getting electric generated either by wind, water, or solar to be able to power all the EVs that would be on the road? Is that even possible?
It's technically impossible today. It's commercially way impossible on a cost basis. You've got to have a min load at night constantly running electricity generation sources. Most of the markets in the U.S., the MISO up north, PJM, those two regions cover 50 states. Our region here in CERC, the southern part of the country, nighttime load, believe it or not, is about 70% of daytime load, the power need. You don't have solar at night, for example, and wind diminishes at night. So you must have a basis of generating facilities running all of the time. We haven't invented anything but that thus far. Okay, if it's can be nuclear, but we've badly impaired our ability to build nuclear plants in this country on a cost basis. That's a very long-term thing to get back into that game, which we should, but just Plant Vogtle, 12 years overdue, 2-3 times the budget to build it. Not realistic, a place to go. So you're looking at, I mean, the need for nighttime power being 70% of what it is during the day dictates renewables can't do that. You can't build enough of them to possibly do that.
So even if you have power generated, whether it's by renewables or non-renewables, now you've got batteries in the car. Where do the batteries come from? Who really is in control of the batteries?
Well, China produces 85% of the lithium-ion batteries in the world, and they do about 87% of the lithium processing necessary to make batteries in the world. So to become totally dependent on them for energy devices and lithium batteries is insanity, geopolitical insanity.
Let's talk about solar power. You're starting to see a lot more of solar power. I read an article by one of the well-known research institutions about solar power. And interestingly, it said it does exactly the opposite of what people think in terms of if you want solar power windmills to reduce, quote, global warming, to reduce a carbon footprint, that the windmills actually do the actual opposite. They actually say that in order to get to a zero base of global warming with windmills, it would take 100 years of renewables, developing 100 years of renewables and having renewables, so that you have less carbon footprint over 100 years to get to where we are now when you install windmills. And the reason is because I think everyone knows common sense. When you turn a fan on in a room, your heat rises up. But when you have the fan running, it circulates the heat and it comes all through the lower parts of the house, for example, or the building. And that's what the windmills do. They keep the heat closer to the surface. So they actually are doing exactly the opposite of what the so-called green energy narrative is saying. Not to mention killing birds, using valuable land, ejecting oil, causing forest fires, and having problems with non-disposable or non-renewable kinds of, non-biodegradable, I should say, propellers.
Yeah, if you're a naturalist and a conservationist, the land use case of wind, specifically wind, and solar is completely non-defendable. The wind case is something like 250 times more land use than a conventional combined cycle or nuclear power plant footprint. The solar case, for example, in the state here, Florida Power and Light have announced the plan to build 90,000 megawatts of utility-scale solar farms between now and 2042. By what they've done to date, the first 45 of these that they've built, 688 acres each one, 90,000 megawatts would consume 1,200 square miles of Florida land. Just give you an example of the land use, and that land use is zero value added for any other purpose because it's totally covered with panels. Wind, a little better because you can still have farming, but you can't have livestock. You can't have human beings living under them because of the noise frequency is not tolerable. So there's huge massive land use issues with these technologies. And the sheer cost on the environmental toll, it only takes about 200 wind turbine towers, which would generate maybe 400 megawatts, to be equal to an entire nuclear power plant of 2,200 megawatts in cement use, in civil infrastructure that needs to be put in the ground to have the tower itself, and the platform for the tower, which is a concrete base. You're talking the amount of concrete in a net power production of about 200 megawatts of wind equal the same concrete infrastructure you'd have in a whole 2,200 megawatt constantly running nuclear power plant.
What does the average person do about this? Because it's very frustrating, I think, for people to see the system and our freedom being attacked and our country being crumbled or attacked in this insanity that would be meant to control with regulation and other kinds of things about telling you whether you can have a gas-powered stove or not. What's the average person to do about this?
Well, the impact on average people, starting with, is huge. If losing the choice, losing consumer choice on stoves, on water heaters, on home heating, on cars, being forced to go electric only removes consumer choice massively, and all of those things will cause prices to be vastly increased for those things you no longer have a choice for. The same thing with electricity that's produced only by part-time devices as opposed to full-time power plants will mean a shortage of it. We're into that now. That's happening now. And you see some of the public narrative suddenly shifting on this, blaming this now on AI and server centers. This is because we've been electricity short now for a few years, and that's growing because of the mass adoption of these part-time things. Cost will rise radically, and that's beginning to happen already for electricity in the country. The last 3.5 years, we're up about 23%. Utilities come into communities and broadcast their goodness. People need to go to the meetings and challenge them aggressively on the true cost of renewables that they're all over applying now, trying to get along with the EPA. Electricity in the country, by the way, is run largely by the states, not by the federal government. Okay. It's
so
state regulated.
Get in contact with your governors,
state
with
reps,
your
state senators, and the governor specifically, who appoints the Public Service Commission members, need to be challenged on these topics and on the cost basis of these topics. Because on a cost basis alone, independent of the bird life and other convection heating caused by wind turbines, the fact of the cost alone and the land use case is completely an obscenity. Costs are on solar about 8 times the capital cost of conventional combined cycle gas-fired power. Offshore wind is about 11 times more costly. Solar, if you take into account the fact that the panels look like they last about 12 to 14 years, a power plant lasts 40 to 50 years, you're talking 8 to 10 times the capital cost to erect that for something that runs a small percentage of the time. Getting Congress,
involved,
legislative
getting
candidates
state
at the
legislators,
state level, really important on this.
Yeah, get involved with your state, and then also Congress. But follow Dave Walsh. You can follow him on Truth Social and also on Getter at Dave Walsh Energy. Dave Walsh Energy, all one word, Truth Social and Getter. Dave, thank you for joining us on Freedom Alive. This has been fascinating, and I think it's a challenge for all of us to learn about this and make a difference.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Matt, this interview illustrates to me the difference between really an unbiased expert versus elected officials who simply advance ideas, and really the fact that truth always exposes, in this case, folly, insanity, just the irrationality of this whole concept that's being advanced.
Yeah, this whole green idea, I mean, obviously we want to protect the planet. We don't want to trash it, but how do you go about doing that in the best way? I would hope that lawmakers and policymakers would sit down and have some time to listen to Dave Walsh and those like him that bring real facts and information to the table so that you can make a rational, informed decision.
Yeah. Let's talk about what those folks can do at home, because Dave made the point about how much of this plays out at the state level. Right?
Yeah, we all think about the federal government, and certainly Dave mentioned that that's a big area of our federal members of Congress because of federal policy, but he made something very important, and I think it's very critical because that brings it down to the state level, that a lot of these power decisions are done in the state legislature and through some of their regulatory powers and commissions that are there. So that is where people really need to get involved, find out, you know, elections matter, find out where people stand, you know, your state house, your state senate, find out where they stand and make sure that people like Dave Walsh and others are in contact with them. You know, make sure that this is a big issue, because sometimes right now it's easy to ignore it, that it's not directly affecting you, although it is. But this particular tidal wave is building, and there's a point of no return. And so that's why it's important that we get involved now, educate ourselves, and educate our representatives as well.
We love bringing you the truth on issues like this. It's a big issue, and we're pleased that we're going to be able to bring Dave Walsh back for a second episode. In closing, remember Ecclesiastes 7, verse 25, which says, "So I turned my mind to understand, to investigate and to search out wisdom and the scheme of things, and to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly." Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. So join us here next time. You'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.